Hello and welcome to a new podcast from the Belt and Road Institute in Sweden. My name is Hussein Askary. Today is Thursday, October the 16th, 2025. Last week and this week have been very, very dramatic weeks in terms of international relations, the trade wars, but also, of course, on the question of peace and war, which is not really our subject today, but there are many important things happening. But we had something very special breaking out which can have major ramifications for the whole international situation. It's a follow-up on the trade wars, but this time it was triggered by some actions that the Chinese government took. We will come to the origins of it, why the Chinese government did that. But first of all, on Thursday, October the 9th, the Chinese Commerce Ministry announced a decision to impose export restrictions on relevant foreign rare earth items, and especially with regards to dual-use items, which means that China will not allow its products to be used in, for example, arms industry. It can be used for civil industries and civil uses, but not for arms industry. And this means a lot for the United States, Europe, and other countries who these rare earths are very important for the arms industry too. And then on October the 10th, Trump issued a very harsh worded tweet around the morning, late in the morning, in which he attacked China. He actually even, President Xi Jinping, and saying that he will not meet with President Xi Jinping in South Korea during the APEC meeting. And so he, in typical Trump manner. What happened is that the US stock markets crashed immediately after his tweet, because what this reminds people of what happened in April, the last round of the trade wars and tariffs imposed on China, because Trump this time again, he said he will impose 100% tariff, and realizing the dilemma where the US stock market, which Trump is so proud of, it can crash under his watch because of his own actions. He retracted some of the tweets he made, and then finally on Sunday he made a much watered down tweet, and he even called President Xi Jinping a very respected leader and that he might meet him in Korea soon. So the markets could open on Monday without having a major turbulence as we experienced earlier. Again, on Friday last week, on October 10th, the Chinese Ministry of Transport Ministry issued a statement saying that the country will charge special port fees on ships owned or operated by US enterprises and organizations and individuals or ships raising the American flag, or from October 14th. This is, of course, a retaliation to a previous Chinese American imposed fees on Chinese ships docking in American ports. The interesting thing is that these statements by the Chinese, and this is a very curious item, which very few people paid attention to, is that these statements were issued by these Chinese ministries and sent to the media in a Word format which cannot be opened by Microsoft Word apps and programs. It can only be opened through what is called the WPS Office, which is a Chinese answer equivalent to the Microsoft Word program. And after that, the Microsoft stocks actually also went down by almost 2%. So these are, these moves are not good for international trade. It's not good for the world economy, but it must have a reason. And then on Monday, October the 13th, we had another disturbing event when the Dutch government seized a Chinese-owned chip-producing company operating in Holland. It's called Nexperia, which produces chips for the European auto industry. And the Dutch government evoked some very old law related to national security to secure technology and supplies for the Dutch market and the European market. This is really unprecedented in a way. what it turned out later during the investigation that the United States actually had, or the Trump administration had put pressure on Holland to deal with this company. So anyway, these developments are taking place now. Everybody is waiting for President Trump and President Xi Jinping to meet in South Korea on the sidelines of the APEC meeting at the end of October to get the final settlement of the tariffs and trade war after several rounds of talks. The latest one was in Madrid last month. So to discuss these matters, we are very honored to invite once again adjunct Professor Warwick Powell from Brisbane, Australia, to discuss these matters. Welcome, Warwick.
Good to be with you again, Hussein.
You have done enormous and excellent work on these matters of the trade war and the situation in general, and what the impact of that is. Now, the question comes to mind is China showing its real power after keeping it unseen for a while? And what is the reality? What is the background to all these moves by China, which many people, because this is some sort of a balance of terror between the two sides. China does not intend to interrupt international trade. But what is the background to this, and why is China moving on these matters now?
Look, at an immediate tactical level, the United States made some announcements on the 29th of September concerning the expansion of some provisions which go to sanctioned entities, and that would have resulted in, or did result in, a range of Chinese companies, their subsidiaries and related entities being caught up in the sanctions net. Now, the reason why that's of particular concern at this moment in time is not only the fact that it is clearly intentionally an aggressive move, but that in fact it breached some understandings that was arrived at between the Chinese and American negotiators in their last meeting in Madrid, which was for both sides to refrain from doing anything that would jeopardize the fragile détente that had been achieved, and which would, as a result of that, undermine or seriously disrupt the possibilities of progress on the trade talks. So, from China's perspective, this was a reaction to America's bad faith and its breach of understandings and agreements that had been reached in their last meeting. Is this China playing its biggest card? I would actually suggest that it's not, but it is playing a strong hand, but it's a known hand. We saw already earlier this year when Liberation Day tariffs were first announced that China was able to push back quite hard. And in fact, the question of rare earths came up then, with dysprosium being the single rare earth in particular that was subject to some intervention from the China side. And that by itself was enough to see the United States react in very ginger or nervous ways and backtracked quite quickly. So I think that episode already told the world, broadly speaking, but also the Chinese side, that the United States does have some serious sensitivities on this question of rare earth element supply. This time round, in its response, clearly one that had been prepared over a period of time with a lot of thought. It came out as part of a package of announcements from the Commerce Ministry, which also included important materials that are used in the manufacturing of batteries and related technologies. And this package of export restrictions or export licensing requirements really, I think, was implemented or announced to jolt the Americans to appreciate that this is not a game, that agreements reached in good faith between negotiating parties need to be kept, and that China will no longer be treated with this level of disrespect. You don't reach agreements and then 3 or 4 weeks later begin to salami slice them and undermine them in the hopes of improving your leverage position before the next meeting. That's not how peers acting in good faith engage with each other. And I think China wanted to be very, very clear this time that this kind of approach, this attitude towards dealing with China would no longer be tolerated. The broader issue that you mentioned, and we can get into it in a little bit more detail as we go, is the relevance of these measures in the broader context of global trade and where China stands. China has spent actually the past 6 months working hard with countries around the world to um, hold the tide coming from the Trump administration that is seeking to undermine the various regimes that are in place that support multilateral trade. So China's moves in relation to these export license requirements must be seen in the context of its ongoing commitments to a fair and open trading regime. In other words, these regulations aren't designed to cruel world trade in these particular materials, but are designed to provide some better governance. And ironically, the measures that have been announced are very much modelled on the kinds of measures that the United States has become a past master at, insofar as the United States uses so-called long-arm jurisdiction methods to not only restrict the export of materials, but also to control the kinds of things that American materials, American technologies, and American intellectual property can be used for. So China is intent on preserving and strengthening global multilateral trade. It is intent on ensuring that its governance of these sorts of materials supports that, but at the same time addresses China's own concerns and their concerns that it has for its own national security. Particularly, why would a country sell the materials that another country, which sees it as an adversary and which places missiles around its peripheries and uses these materials then to go and make more missiles? Why would you do that? You'd have rocks in your head. But also, China has made it very clear in the Commerce Ministry's announcement that it is doing this in the interests of ensuring that China lives up to its obligations in relation to minimizing weapons proliferation globally.
Yeah, one of the reasons that the President Trump freaked out is is because what this means, the restrictions on the rare earths and also permanent magnets are very crucial for the arms industry in the United States. And the United States is almost all totally dependent on China. Most of the world is dependent on China on this. So what it means is that it will disrupt the whole American policy, of dominance through military power and even peace through strength, which they call. But also the United States have promised to sell arms to the EU and other NATO partners to support Ukraine, and all that is in shambles now. But if it's consistent with China's policy for what they call global peace, that it will not reverse this policy of dual use, will it?
No, it won't. And so in many ways, there are 4 parts to this governance regime. The first part is that humanitarian uses will be allowed through without an issue. The second part is, as you mentioned earlier, civilian uses will also be treated very much as business as usual. The fourth part, and I'll come back to the third part in a moment, is military uses, where the Commerce Ministry made it very clear that as a matter of principle, or that in principle, applications for these materials and technologies for military use and the manufacture of weapons would not be approved or would not gain permission. And then you've got this mixed use category. Now, mixed use is a very broad, or it could be a very broad or a very narrow conceptualization. And I think that there is likely to be quite a lot of give and take potential in relation to what constitutes this domain or this category of mixed use. And I would expect that over the next 6 months or so, we will see further negotiations and ultimately some clarifications as to what will be constituted as prohibited mixed uses and under what conditions potentially mixed use uses could nonetheless have access to these materials because they will be used for civilian purposes. So this is an area where there is, I think, potentially room for the parties to ultimately arrive at some understandings. It's also a space where other countries that import these materials from China will no doubt seek to negotiate favourable access opportunities based on legitimate uses that they have for these materials and technologies. The big loser in this is the military industrial complex, first and foremost. But there are some other downstream industries that are likely to be impacted as well. The automotive sector, which uses some of these materials quite significantly, particularly in terms of batteries and other things like that, will be affected. And of course, it's important to recognize that many of the rare earth elements are critical to the manufacture of microprocessors, and that will have an impact also on the AI industry, particularly in the United States. So, so we've got the military industrial complex, which is the cornerstone of American global military and power projection, on the one hand being impacted. And then you've got what is in effect the only industry driving the American economy at the moment, namely artificial intelligence, also being impacted. And that goes to your proposition around President Trump's relationship, shall we say, with the U.S. stock market, because the U.S. stock market, in large part, is being held up by the attractiveness
Yeah, they
of
say
the AI sector.
what is called the American economy is mostly is the AI bubble in the stock markets and all these stable coin and all these financial things, but it's not related to the physical economy, which shows through this rare earth and permanent magnet dilemma. I listened to an American expert this week. It was quite ironical. He said, look, we have lost this thing. We should try to rebuild our capacity or build a capacity to extract and refine rare earths. But he said it will take 5 to 10 years, first of all. And in the meantime, we will need Chinese expertise, Chinese technology, and Chinese machinery to build our own uh, capacity. So it's in Trump's view is lose lose, but maybe it's win-win for the world and the United States and China. I don't. Do you think China will help the United States build its manufacturing bases?
Well, not today. It won't. I think the relationships and the tone of some of the things that have been said in the last week would militate against that. But China is also a pragmatic country that is able to take on board a broader responsibility. An impoverished America is actually not in anybody's interests, in large part because an impoverished America, which will exacerbate its own internal contradictions, is also an America that lashes out at the rest of the world. Whenever America that has domestic challenges, structurally, economically, socially, and its tendency is to seek out external enemies and external parties that it can hold responsible for its own domestic problems. And through that, firstly, distract people, number one, but also, hopefully, from the point of view of the political elite, galvanize an American population away from holding the elite responsible and more towards the external, party. So an impoverished America is actually a risk to others in the world. So China, I think, will be mindful that it may need to have serious and good faith discussions with the Americans about ultimately what that might look like. It's not going to come quickly anyway. I think that the idea of asking China for this kind of assistance, because that will
I
be how
think,
it will be perceived, will just not be something that this current administration can bring itself to do at
yeah,
this moment in time.
yeah, yeah. I mean, you cannot remedy in Arabic proverb. It says, the shaman or the physician cannot heal what took a, a lifetime to destroy. And the American and even the European economies took 50 years of deindustrialization and financialization to reach this period. But China, I can give you an example of how generous China is. When the EU decided to do de-risking on the question of electric vehicle batteries and rare earths and so on, so they financed a major project here in Sweden. Billions of euros, tens of billions of euros were invested to de-risk, so become independent of China. And then there was this company established called Northvolt, and Northvolt was supposed to replace Chinese products in the clean technology, area. What happened is all the machinery installed in the factories of Northvolt came from China. The engineers who installed the machinery were Chinese engineers, and the people who operate the whole system were recruited from outside Sweden because we don't have the skilled labor to run such large scale industrial processes with this sophistication. So they also brought in engineers and workers from around the world, trained by Chinese experts to do the job. So the Chinese say, we don't mind, you want to de-risk, you want to build alternative to our products, well, we will help you build the factories and so on. Unfortunately, it went bankrupt after 1 year. It's the largest bankruptcy in the history of Sweden, and enormous amounts of money invested by the Swedish government and the EU into this project. So it's a very interesting difference in mindset between China and the West. So this is quite interesting. This also leads us to the question, are the Chinese telling the Americans, look, your market is not so important for us. There's a whole world opening up outside the United States. We can both have markets, but also sources like the soybean dilemma. The American farmers now screaming that because of Trump, they lost the largest market in China because China can go to Brazil and Argentina to get what they get from the United States. So is China telling the United States, you don't really mean so much for our export economy?
Well, I think in part they are, but they're doing it without having to say so. The last 10 to 15 years of evolution in global trade patterns has already seen the United States progressively decentered. It is no longer the most important trading nation in relationship to just about any other country in the world. Its most significant trading relationships are with Mexico and with Canada. And after that, it starts to fall away quite substantially. It still has, of course, a relationship across the Atlantic, but when you look at global maps and time series maps of the evolution of global trade and relationships, you do see that China has evolved to become the most significant global trading partner of about 150 or so nations in the world. From China's own point of view, exports to the United States now comprise a little bit less than 3% of China's gross domestic product. And that number, fluctuates a little bit. But as China's GDP grows, historically, of course, trade with the US has grown, and so proportionally it stayed the same. But importantly, what's also happening at the same time, Hussein, is that China's trading relationships with everybody else in the world are actually growing faster than they have been with the United States. We know that since the Liberation Day tariffs, that trade has dropped substantially between the United States and China, but the evidence is very clear that Chinese enterprises were able to pivot and expand their trading relationships with just about everyone else in the world. Now, that doesn't happen overnight, I might add. Mainstream neoclassical economics would just think that adjustments get made instantaneously, right? But the reality is that these enterprises have either had established positions in these other markets already, which they've spent time and effort developing, or they rapidly adopted and adapted themselves to these new markets and trained themselves. So you'll see in China large training sessions for e-commerce people and salespeople in Spanish, right? Because they needed to be able to sell, particularly into Latin America. Ditto also Portuguese. So a lot of the e-commerce salespeople and sales support, who of course were dealing with many other countries in the world in English, rapidly went off and learned Spanish and improved their Spanish to a point where they could, boost their trade into these sorts of markets. So Chinese enterprises have adapted very quickly. They've leveraged existing relationships and existing channels, and it continues a long-standing pattern now. The United States, frankly, is not as important economically speaking to the global economy as it once was, and that's just the fact.
Well, Warwick, it's interesting that you mentioned the Latin America and Spanish and Portuguese language. These days, the Trump administration is mobilizing for war or regime change in Venezuela as a starting point because the whole U.S. War Department policy is to dominate the Western Hemisphere and Latin America to prevent China or anyone else from having any influence there. But it's now official that the Trump administration has uh, sanctioned operations by the CIA inside Venezuela. So how do you see this development? Is this something which is directed against China or directed against this new world order which is taking shape?
Look, it's part of a long-standing tradition of the United States to intervene and disrupt in countries around the world that it doesn't see eye to eye with, and particularly in Latin America. Over the course of the last 70 years, the United States has been involved in countless regime changes, coups d'etats, and assorted political interference operations in Latin America, all in the name of protecting the homeland. Of course, what it's doing is ensuring that these countries have political regimes that are on side with Washington and which will do Washington's bidding in the region. That undermines the ability of Latin America, which is an incredibly rich continent in terms of natural resources, from developing and becoming a significant alternative, so to speak, to the United States in that part of the world. So a lot of this is driven by, very typical American approaches to its relationship with the rest of the world, arguably going back to the Monroe Doctrine. I mean, you will recall that at the beginning of this current presidential term, we've already seen talk of making moves on the Panama Canal. Obviously, we're aware of periodic discussions concerning Canada itself and Greenland as part of the greater Americas, if you will, from north to south. So, unfortunately, I think that this is par for the course. It is an ongoing expression of deeply ingrained habits of public policy conduct. And the end outcome of this, or the potential end outcome of this, will be a further destabilization of a country that will undermine its ability to embark on peaceful economic development, which will raise the living standards of people in that country. But of course, the United States doesn't really care about that very much.
You mentioned earlier the question of China's trade with the United States, China's trade with other countries. Now, how much of this? I was actually in China recently. I was a couple of conferences, and most of the talk there is about the global South. And I was asking people, this what is this new trend? They said, no, this is the future of China's relationship to the world economy in general, because the global South, the BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the ASEAN, all these nations are now emerging as new, economic powerhouses. They don't have the same purchasing power or technological level as the United States and the EU, but they are emerging. They are, reaching to the up in the ladder of the global value chain. You mentioned to me that you were recently in South Africa for a conference on on development financing. So how does the talk go over there?
Yeah, look, I mean, China's role over the last 15 years in particular through the Belt and Road Initiative is understood to have been a very significant contribution to economic development. And everyone, of course, is aware of the rhetoric that comes from the Western powers in relation to the BRI, but very few people who are actually serious about economic development in the global South give any of that commentary from the Western powers, the time of day. People know what the history is, and the history has been that in the colonial era and the years immediately after colonialism in the post Second World War, that the developed countries of the world continued to treat the undeveloped or the global South as basically countries with natural resources to rape and pillage. And they continued to do that for many decades. So even after granting independence in a legal sense, they maintained economic domination of these countries in the way that they structured the economic relationships and the financial relationships. All of that is beginning to unravel in a much more serious and concerted way. We see in Africa, for example, particularly West Africa, there has been some substantial changes in the Sahel over the last few years where we've seen local new governments emerge that are a lot more focused on autonomous and sovereign economic development and trying to extricate the countries and their people from the oppressive, exploitative relationships that they had with the West, and particularly France in this case. So China's role in all of that has been an important one, and it continues to be important. During the tail end of the pandemic, we saw China's investments in the Belt and Road reduce for a couple of years, and there was a lot of commentary at the time, again from many in the Western mainstream media and the world of think tank commentary, that talked about that 2 years as somehow evidence that this was the end of the road. Well, um, all of that's turned around again, and this last 9 months has been almost record-breaking months as far as China's ongoing investments into the development of countries of the global South. So that's the first thing. The second thing, of course, we've seen, and again, let's just have a look at what's happened since Trump's Liberation Day tariff announcements. Well, we've seen massive growth in Chinese trade with countries in Africa and Southeast Asia. And in fact, China's trade with Belt and Road countries now comprises over 51% of China's overall trade. The rate of growth of China's trade with Belt and Road partner countries is greater than is the rate of growth of China's trade, generally speaking. And it's also greater than the rate of growth of world trade, broadly speaking, as well. So these trading relationships and investment relationships are quite central to how the world is reconfiguring. The contours of value flows have changed. The global South is not just peripheral anymore as a source of raw materials alone, but is standing up and demanding and speaking out strongly for value-added economic development, and that means being able to develop its own energy capabilities, because without energy capabilities, it's not very easy to do much else. And we've seen in the last 6 months, well, in fact, last 18 months, very significant growth in renewable energy trade, for example, with African countries importing and installing an incredible amount of solar and wind and battery technologies. Of course, there are more conventional forms of energy as well, and China is also pushing the boundaries from a science and technological point of view in other areas, whether it's in nuclear, particularly some of the safety aspects of some of the new technologies, thorium, and of course we also have quite a lot of developments and applications in things like green hydrogen, where the low cost of renewable energy from solar and wind is now being converted into stores of energy that can then be applied in downstream uses. So China's doing incredible things in the broader energy and electrification space. The Global South is benefiting from that in terms of hardware, software, people know-how, and scientific development. And it's these initiatives that I think lead the people you speak to in China, for example, to really see that the next 20, 30 years of global economic opportunity is going to come from the development of the Global South on the back of the hard and soft infrastructure investments that China has been contributing towards.
Yeah, I mean, we have witnessed actually in the past 3, 4 years that a large number of industrial parks are opening up in Africa and West Asia. Many major Chinese companies are moving a lot of the production processes into like home appliances, electronics, and materials like that to Egypt, to Saudi Arabia, to Ethiopia, Uganda. So you have this enormous market in Africa and West Asia is being, is the production process is taking place on site with the help of Chinese technology, Chinese companies. And gradually the raw materials also will, instead of being exported cheaply, they will be processed on the continent in Africa or in West Asia, and so on and so forth. But also is that a lot of the special agreements that China has with Egypt, North Africa, because they have also free trade agreements with the EU, it's much easier for those countries to become industrial hubs to export to the EU, which many people in the EU are now nervous about because there are high quality products coming from Egypt and Morocco to Europe much cheaper today than before. So Africa is being transformed. West Asia, the so-called Middle East, is being transformed. So the old relations don't work, but I think the Chinese philosophy of win-win means that you have to prosper your neighbor. You have to let your customers grow and become wealthier instead of pushing them down and making them dependent on you. So this is a fascinating new trend in the world, which I hope the EU and the United States will learn from and follow suit, and for their benefit and also for the benefit of the world. So anyway, Warwick, it's always enriching and interesting to discuss with you and let our audience get your insights. Thank you very much for taking the time for being with us.
Absolute pleasure again, Hussein.
Thank you.